Welcome back to Mr. Orth's Flip Classroom. Today, a look at the research process, more specifically, methods. Let's revisit the 4 questions. First, what do I want to know? This becomes your research question. Second, what data can answer that question? That's your data. How will I gather those data? That's your method, today's focus. What will I do with those data once I have them? That's your analysis. Alright, there are 3 primary types of studies. Though many of you will already have determined what you intend to do for your study, it's not a bad idea to have a general context for the primary types of studies. First, and what most of you will be doing, will be quantitative studies. Quantitative studies focus on gathering many answers to a small set of questions. These obtain a large number of responses or amount of data. So the idea is that the answers are shorter, more precise, perhaps even limited or multiple choice, and you get a large number of those. Therefore, because you have a large number, you need to do statistical analysis to make sense of that data. Oftentimes we'll use a survey method. We'll talk about survey versus questionnaire here in a little bit. Second type of study, a qualitative. This focuses on gathering fewer, more detailed answers to a larger set of questions. So there are not going to be as many respondents or participants in the study, but there's going to be much more data mined from each individual participant. In this case, more time is going to need to be spent organizing and categorizing responses because they're going to be unique. Think fill in the blank, interviews, short answers. There's no boxes checked here. It's going to be individual components with information from each particular participant being truly unique and looking for patterns in those unique responses. Because those patterns are going to be more intensified in terms of looking for them, it's going to take more effort. There's very little or perhaps even no statistical, or in this case mathematical, analysis to make sense of those data. Oftentimes we'll use interviews or case studies as well as ethnographies, looking at an entire ethnic group of some type and looking at characteristics within those. Another type, which applies for those folks who are going to be looking at, for example, advertising. This is a content analysis. In that case, a content analysis focuses on reviewing the content of other published or existing media. So you're looking at communications that already exist. You're not looking at people, you're not necessarily going to have responses from individuals here. Content analysis tries to be somewhat comprehensive. You try to cover almost everything having to do with what's in that particular topic or content. More time is going to be spent organizing and categorizing responses or information from those. This requires some statistical analysis to make sense of the data. It could be, in some cases, totaling up and determining how many times or in what ways certain words or phrases or information is used within that source. A content analysis often uses journals, magazines, books, videos, speeches, etc. as the content. Imagine going through all of Abraham Lincoln's reported speeches, all recorded speeches and the scripts of those, looking for certain themes or characteristics or qualities that are present in each, or what was different in some of those speeches compared to others. That would be an example of a content analysis, as well as what some are doing, which would be looking at the advertisements that are in or used as part of a particular TV show or time slot, and looking at those that are already there. For the method or the process you're going to use to actually gather your data for your study, you'll be evaluated on the following elements: sampling, processes including advantages and disadvantages, the proof of predictions, data described, coding, plan for data analysis, and instrument. Since several of these terms above are going to be considered vocabulary terms which you might actually need to define, as always, take time to pause the video if you need to write things down and then return to it. First, sampling. 2 terms related to sampling. First of all, remember that sampling here can actually be considered a noun, such as the sample itself, or sampling as a verb. Related terms are population and sample. Population is considered all relevant or possible participants. If you wanted to have everyone in the entire group that you could possibly include, all students everywhere in 9th grade, that's your population. You might narrow that down more, saying all 9th graders at Metcalf. If you want to include every member of that group, your actual method, in this case for sampling, is called a census. I know you've heard the term before, perhaps in your civics class, but in this case, a population where you study everyone in that group or include everyone as participants, that's called a census. In most cases, using the entire population isn't realistic. Therefore, we'll sample a portion of that population being asked to participate. So when you think about your study and your questions more precisely, who or what will you ask to complete your questionnaire? Think about things such as how many people? Do you need just one large total number, or you need to break it down into certain subgroups? Particularly if you have certain qualities or characteristics which matter to your study. Does gender matter to your study? If so, then you probably want to make sure that you have, in fact, a certain number of males and females. If age or grade matters to your study, then you're going to want to make sure you have representatives from both of those or all three of those age groups. Does their activity background, or their other experience, other qualities, characteristics in terms of what they do, how they spend time, what programs they're a part of, which programs they're not a part of. If those things are the case, we're going to want to still sample those populations, but we probably want to look at how many individuals are in the population of each subgroup. How many students in ninth grade STEM are there totally? But even then, for sampling, you might have to decide, how are you defining that? Does someone involved in STEM in ninth grade, do they have to be involved in all 3 STEM courses in order to be considered a STEM ninth grade student? Should they be only involved in one? What if they're involved in only 2 classes? Does that count? So consider very carefully how you're going to define that. Even in terms of your sample, who you're going to have in the study, it might not be so clear. If you want to do students from all of Metcalf, and you only have students in STEM, are you really asking your study or pretending your study is going to represent all of Metcalf ninth graders? Not a small question. You may hear someone refer to your sample in your study as your N, a lowercase n, a variable, such as you'd find in mathematics. In most of statistics dealing with studies, your N is your actual sample size, how many individuals are in that particular study. I would also encourage you with sampling to make sure that you include more than the minimum number of responses you'd like to get. So it's N plus, or literally, if you need to have 5 individuals participate in a study, 5 males and 5 females, you probably want to ask more than 5 of each in case one of those responses is unusable or someone doesn't return it or complete it at all. Next thought, processes. As you may have heard before in my class, I'm not a big fan of having your first idea come to you and then stopping there. If your first idea is your best idea, it'll still be your best idea once you consider other possibilities. That's no different for this particular assignment and project. Therefore, you're expected to identify at least 2 different ways you could gather data to answer your research questions. Again, they may not be 2 entirely different ways, but they may be similar with some specific variations. For example, since many of you are going to be doing some kind of questionnaire study, do you intend to do that on paper, or are students going to fill out a Google form? It may not seem like much of a difference, but it does. If you're going to handle just a paper form, are you going to personally deliver that and explain that to the individuals responding to that? Or are you going to have teachers distribute that for you? When you start looking at the process, the question is even, how are you putting that in the hands of the teacher? How much time are people going to have to actually respond and return that to you? What are you going to do if they're not returning those in? So the process is more than just an idea of, well, I'm just going to give out a questionnaire. There's a lot more to it than that. And again, your processes may be similar, but they're going to have some specific variations in terms of how you're actually going to get the information back to you. That's your end product, your end result. The way you get there is going to vary. Even what you choose to do as a process may end up being different in some way than what you actually do to complete your study. Once you've identified at least 2, and you don't have to do more than 2, but I recommend 2 for sure. Once you identify those 2 different ways you could possibly get your data, then state the advantage and disadvantage of each of those processes. Pros and cons. You don't have to put that into a table or a T-chart of some type. Some folks find that advantageous. The key is that you recognize that even what you choose to do for a process, there's going to be limitations. There's going to be problems potentially with the way you go about doing that. If you know what those are in advance, perhaps you can control for those or modify your process to limit the damage that can do to the validity of your data. Once you do decide which of those 2 processes you're going to use for your study, explain which one it is. Make sure you state it, as well as at least a brief description of why you chose that one over the other, which pros outweighed the pros of the other, and which cons weren't nearly as damaging. Proof of predictions. This sounds confusing, but if we take a look at the 3 steps on this slide, you'll find it's not so bad. The first thing you should do is copy your prediction or hypotheses, depending on your teacher's preference. For our purposes, let's go with predictions. What would it take for you to figure out whether or not you're right? Well, if we paste those predictions on a new page, a new document, or just a new portion, new segment of what you're working on for your draft, we want to take each individual prediction and say, what would it take? So for each prediction then, second step, describe what your data would have to show you for your prediction to be correct. If, for example, you think there's a relationship between 2 different variables, you think that males are more likely to report that they get less sleep on a school night. Well, what would you have to have for your results? What would your male results in terms of hours of sleep have to show you compared to your female results? Are you looking for simply, 1 increment more? Are we looking if we're in terms of ratios or percentages? Does 51% versus 49%, does that mean you're right? Or is it possible if you only had 5 respondents? That's a big difference. Do you feel like you need to have a 60% or a supermajority, 66%, 2/3, 75%, 80%, 90%? At what point do you feel like your data proved you correct in terms of your prediction? Also, we need to state the converse of that, which is what would be needed to disprove your predictions. Again, your prediction is going to be a statement that can be proven either correct or incorrect. It's not about being right or wrong. Your data is going to prove that one way or the other. You don't need to emote at bars whether you are disappointed or encouraged that you're right. You simply need to make that statement, and your data will tell you if you're right or wrong. Again, if you're using numbers in your proof of prediction section, please state what the specific numbers for proof and disproof would be in order to actually prove you correct or incorrect. The data itself. Things to think about data. First, you need to describe that data. What kinds of information will your data be? They can be words, phrases, images, numbers. The hint for that is look at the values for your variables. That's what your data is going to look like. Second step, how are you going to record your data? The term for this we use here is called coding. In particular, for a number of you looking at certain variables, such as numbered things, how can you categorize the possible response or details? You don't want to ask students how many hours of sleep they get per night and simply leave that as a blank to fill in, because some of them might say about or around. They might do half hours, 3/4 hours. They might put it in minutes. You want to narrow that down for them and have them select things. The example here is if you want to ask someone their GPA, some people write that as a letter. Some will put that as a number. Is it the whole number? Is it numbers to the 10th place, to the 100th place? Are some going to do a combination of that? They're going to say around or about. So do you want them to write down whatever they want, or do you want to group the data? For example, you can have them check a box for 3.50 to 4.00. Or you want to do it in terms of increments, 3.60 to 4.00, 3.30 to 3.59, etc. Certain things like gender, yeah, you can put M for male and F for female for categorizing those. But even things like defining your data in terms of age. Again, some folks think that age, and we do grade, well, that's a different variable. Again, look at your data. What are the values for that data, and how do you want to mark those? How are you going to narrow those down? The coding step might be something you've already done because you defined that so clearly at the earlier stage. For now, get back to it. Next thing is, can you preserve your data to be checked later? That's your paper, audit, video, audio. I mean, do you have to necessarily go back to it and just remember what happened? Or can you leave it some way that you can record it for future uses? Keep in mind, if you're going to do observation, you want to do what you plan to do, when you plan to do it, how you plan to do it. If any part of that changes, how would you adjust? Can you restart? What changes would or could you make? You might need another set of eyes doing observation. So please bear in mind when you're doing data, if you're doing questionnaires, you always have those papers or those digital forms. Otherwise, you might need backup. For analysis, now that you have your data, what will you do with it? Are you going to organize it, such as time or topic? Are you going to code it, groups, labels, etc.? What about other values? We might have forgotten those. And what kind of graphs or tables will make the data clearest to your audience? Can you quantify the data in any way, such as raw totals overall for each group or subgroup? Frequency, make the mean of the data, mean, median, mode. Also for instrument, what will you use to gather those data? For most of you, this is going to be a questionnaire. For a questionnaire, please remember to create clear directions, only ask what you need to know, and keep it as short as we'll answer all research questions. Don't forget to test that what you think you're going to use for an instrument. Test it with a small group of people who aren't actually going to participate in the final study. Revise that instrument and test it again. Only when you feel like you're getting consistent responses and effective feedback about your instrument, then is it ready possibly to be used. Don't be surprised if in your proposal stage you're asked mostly to revise your instrument, and that might be the biggest hang-up to getting approved to do your actual study. If your instrument's not ready, your study's not ready. You've had a lot to think about from this. I encourage you to watch this video more than once if you need to. Come back to Mr. Orth with questions as you have them. Good hunting.